Hi, welcome to the first episode of my new course called Starting on the Right Foot with Blueprints. Let's start with the introduction to this course and what is this course going to be about. So this course is going to be aimed mainly at people that are just starting out with Unreal and want to build good habits with Blueprints and understand them right away. And for people that are already using Unreal somewhat but don't understand Blueprints well enough to use them efficiently. And in the first video, we are going to cover just a basic overview of Blueprints and also inheritance or just kind of introduction to it and parent-child dynamics and relationships basically. So let's start with the overview of Blueprints. So if I right click in the content browser, and I'm gonna assume basic stuff that you know where the content browser is, where the outliner is and stuff like that. So if you right click in the content browser, you can go to Blueprint and then Blueprint class. You can do similar thing by clicking add here. And in here you have list of bunch of different blueprint types that we're gonna cover soon. But let's click on one of the most simple ones, which is actor. And now that we have created this asset, this is where you're gonna have few things. First, you have your viewport, then you're gonna have construction script that you're gonna cover in a future video, and then we have event graph. And this is basically where you're gonna put all of your logic for blueprints. So you're gonna have this event graph where you can trigger events and then use these events to trigger functions or other events. And then you're gonna have your list of functions, macros, variables, all put in here that you can kind of use to combine and create some logic. So blueprints are basically kind of an abstraction put on top of C++, so you can visually code instead of coding by using text. And that's about it for blueprints. So let's delete this actor. Next thing that we're going to cover is just the basics of inheritance. So inheritance basically means that you can create a blueprint that is a parent and then create a copy of that blueprint that is a child that can have additional functionality on top of it. And the parent-child just basically means kind of how you should see their relationship. So the parent is kind of the base class, and then you have the child that basically inherits stuff from the parent and then can add its own custom stuff on top of it. So let's click right click again and go to blueprint class. And in here, Unreal gives you right away an option to kind of see the hierarchy and how stuff works with the blueprints. In here, if you click on this arrow, you can see there is a lot of blueprint types, but we are not really interested in most of them. Most of them you won't even use, but there is few of them that we are interested in, which is object, actor, and then we are going to cover pawn and character. Just by looking at this hierarchy, you can see that actor is indented. That means that basically it is a child of an object, and that basically means that it inherits everything that object gives. An object is basically a class, a C++ class that has some basic functionality defining some stuff how blueprints work, and then actor adds something on top of it, and that's kind of the general idea. So in here I created an actor, and then I clicked right click on the actor and clicked create child blueprint class. Then I just named it actor child. I put it in a level so I can show you kind of the differences of it. So let's first open the actor. So this is the parent. I added text 3D, and for showing 3D text, you're just gonna have enable a plugin for it, which is I think named 3D text. And I just added text and I set the text to A. Now let's say we want to have multiple letters, or we want to change the letter, but we want to have both of them. We could create a child and then change some properties on the child. So if I open the child, let's click open full blueprint editor. Let's click on the text 3D. We can see how I changed this text, and now I can also reset it. This basically means to set default value or the value of the parent. So what is happening is that I created this child, and now I can change the letter, and it is different than of the parent. Now if I take another parent here and put it in the level, and if I tried to change text in here, I will be able to change it even though this is not a child, but this is just temporary. This is just changing the text in the instance of this blueprint class. So when you pull a blueprint into your level, you're basically creating an instance, and that instance can have custom options, but it does not change the base class or the class inside your asset browser. If I go directly here in the actor and try to change the text, let's say we want C, we can see this guy changed, but our other instance that we changed the text, we can see we have this button to reset the property, and if you click on this, now it goes to C. Before it would go to A because A is the default property. If you go to our child, we can do the similar thing. Now we cannot reset it in here, we have to go directly in the actor child, and the reason for this is that since this instance is the instance of the child, not of the parent, it does have the letter that the child has by default, which is B, which we changed in here. So if I change this to, let's say, D, we can see now we can reset it, but we're going to reset it to B. So let's go to child. Now if I change something in here, let's say on R, we can compile, save. We can see now it's letter R, and that's because we are kind of using the default property, which means we're reading this blueprint class and not the blueprint instance that is in the level. So that is kind of the general idea. And just to show you kind of what can happen if I change the parent, so let's take the parent and let's extrude it, let's say 20. We can see how everyone changed. The child, another instance of the parent, and the parent that we were editing. So when you change the class, anyone that's using the default property of the class is gonna change, and since this child is using the default property of the parent, it's also gonna change. But if I open this child and then change the extrude to 5, let's say, now it doesn't matter if you change this to, let's say, 45, the child is not gonna change because we said that that specific property we want to override it and basically set it to our own custom thing. Another thing, let's go back and let's create a function in the actor. Let's name it test. Let's compile and save. If we go to the child and let's click override, we can see we have our test function in here and we can basically override it. And when you're overriding stuff, what's happening in here is basically you have your override call that you can make and you have your function. So if you put anything in here, it's going to first trigger whatever this function does in the parent, and then it's going to trigger your own custom code. So the example would be if I put print and let's do print A. So this is the parent, and let's go to the child and let's do print again. And yeah, I didn't cover basically how you can add stuff to your blueprints or nodes. You can just right click, type whatever you want, and you can basically add any nodes. So let's do print B. So now let's leave these two guys. Yeah, also we need to call this function somewhere. So I'm just gonna call it in the child and not in the parent, so you can kind of see what's happening. And you can see a little bit of a difference here is in the parent you don't have that additional node, and that is because the parent does not need to call anything from its parent. So basically this child actually has the parent that he can call or override the functions from. And to actually add this call to parent function, you can right click on the node or the event and add call to parent. So now let's get our test function and let's call it in here. So now keep in mind in here we have the call in the parent and then our own call. So let's click play. And we can see we first print A and then print B, which basically means we triggered this print and then we triggered this print. But now let's say we don't want to call the parent function. Let's go back, let's click play. And we can see we're only printing B. That basically means we overridden the parent function, we did not add on to it. And of course, if we have the parent and we want to print in here, or not print in here, we call the test here and just disable the test in the parent or in the child. And let's see what happens. We get our print A, and the parent never cares about or doesn't know about what the child does, but the child does know what the parent does. And one other thing that we can do is just call the parent function, but not call anything on yourself. And if I disable this in the parent, if we click play, we basically get nothing because we do need to trigger something. So I would have to add it in here, and I'll click play, and we get print A and print B. So that's kind of basics for how the child can override functions in the parent and how you can kind of think about interactions. And we're going to think about pros and cons or talk about pros and cons later. For this, I think there are a lot of things that can go wrong here. So if you change something in the parent and you have few children, or even nested inheritance where you have multiple children of the children of the children, changing some value in the parent can give you a bunch of errors or have unintended consequences because the children are also changed. But we're going to talk about that in the future. The last thing that we're going to talk in this video is about how few of the classes in Unreal work, so you kind of get the idea of how Blueprint classes work, so you can kind of utilize them better. So the main class is the object class, and basically everything derives from it. So if I click on the blueprint, and this is of course just for blueprints, I'm not talking in C++ or how it works in C++. So we can see if I minimize this, we have 700 items, but we are showing none because the object, they're all inside the object. The object is kind of just the default setup for all of the blueprints, and then we add some additional functionality. So the next thing that we have, or one of the most important blueprints that you're going to use, is an actor. And what we get with the actor is whatever object gives us, so some definitions which are not important right now. And we get transforms, which means we can put it in the level. So you cannot put an object in the level, but you can put an actor in the level. And we get some basics for replication. So if I open an actor, go to class defaults, we got some basic replication stuff. And this goes with the whole replication system that Unreal gives you. And you can utilize it, you don't have to, but in general it's pretty good, so you can kind of have some options in here. There is, of course, more stuff that you get in these classes, but I'm just covering kind of the biggest stuff, so just get a general idea how you can use them. Now, one issue with the actor is that you cannot possess it. So in Unreal you have a class called player controller, which is kind of player's representation in the game. So it receives inputs from the player, it is spawned when the player joins the game, and basically the player controller can take possession of a pawn or a child of a pawn, which is the character, and that way you can kind of get control of the characters and stuff like that. So pawn basically has everything that actor has, so transform, replication, and can be possessed. Possessed means the player controller can take control of it. And then we have the character, which is basically a pawn, which means it can be possessed, it has transform, replication, and it has character movement component, so Unreal's solution for general character movement. Of course, if you don't like their component, you can create your own. You can create a pawn blueprint class and you can start from there, or you can start from the character. For most bipedal or even different types of characters, usually you can start from the character class. So it has character movement component, it has capsule component. Most of the ways how general character collision is represented in the games is capsule, so you just get a capsule by default. And then on the capsule you have a skeletal mesh attached, which is usually what you need for the character, because you need an animation blueprint and different animations that morph the skeletal mesh basically. So these three classes are one of that you're probably going to use the most, except for some general classes like game instance, game mode, player control, and stuff like that you're going to cover in future videos. So yeah, hopefully this makes sense. So if I go to blueprint class, click on the actor, scroll it a little bit, try to find our pawn. So we need to go here so we can see the pawn. And if you even hover for a lot of the blueprint classes, you don't have a description, so you can possess it and save input. And you have the character, and if I select it, we can see kind of the general idea that I explained. So the pawn doesn't have this, we only have this on the character. We have the mesh, and also have the arrow. I didn't mention it because it's not important, it's just a visual representation for forward, but it's not necessary. But it is defined, so keep in mind, since this is the child, this blueprint I created is the representation for the character, and the character is the child of the pawn. We cannot delete this, so I don't have an option to remove this. So one thing about parent-child relationship is that child cannot remove stuff from the parent. So that's kind of one big thing where with inheritance is the child has to have everything that parent has. So that's kind of a thing to worry about. But yeah, keep this in mind. So if you just want an object in a scene, you would choose an actor. If you just want like a simpler representation, you don't want any character movement, skeletal mesh, whatever, just something that can be possessed, you can do pawn. And then if you need typical character for an RPG first person, you would select this class. And also there is some different classes like vehicle class or different representations. So this is just kind of one path. Character is just one way to kind of represent a pawn. And actor, of course, has its own children except for the pawn. So there is kind of bunch of stuff. You can always just right click, go to blueprint class, and let's find something. Let's say save game. We can select that. Save game gives us some variables, and then we can use this to create a save game file or stuff like that. So you can always go into the blueprint, just click on them and see what's new or what's different. So you can also click override, and here you can see all of the functions that you have access to from the parent, and also you can see the differences there. So yeah, that's an introduction to blueprints and inheritance.